Hi, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex, here again in Brussels at the European Development Days, joined by a very special guest, Pascal Lamy, who is, I think, well known to our audience at Devex as the, until very recently, just 2 months ago, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, an organization that has major implications on global development, of course. And so we wanted to steal a few minutes of your time to find out where are we on the trade and development agenda. Obviously, the Doha round hasn't really completed. It's still in sort of a long process. Here at EDD, there's a lot of talk of trade, particularly in an environment where aid budgets are sort of stuck and fixed as an important leverage point. Give us a sense of where we're headed.
Well, the long answer to your question is in a book I just published last week at Cambridge University Press, which deals with this nexus between trade and development, among other nexuses between trade and other things. So that's the long answer. It's written. The short answer is there's nothing like trade or aid. Trade works for development, but it doesn't work for development automatically. You know, this old view that you just have to open and God will take care of the rest and things will miraculously happen. That's not what experience tells us. What experience tells us, and I spent many years thinking about this and on the ground, is that yeah, trade opening works better than not, but it works well when some specific conditions which have to do with your capacity to trade are there. And this is where there is an issue with some developing countries whose capacity to trade, assuming they got the most favorable trade regime in terms of market access abroad.
Low tariffs and whatever. Yeah.
Zero tariff, duty-free, quota-free. If your harbor is jammed, if you have to pay bribes on a truck on a 200 kilometers road 5 times, if your energy system breaks down the moment your mangoes have to be refrigerated, whatever market access you will have, it won't work. So let's go upstream from trade crossing a border and look at the logistics, look at the infrastructures, which are things where capacity building takes time.
Yeah, and do you think the aid agencies like Europe Aid, are they focused enough on this issue of facilitation of trade as opposed to just thinking about barriers to trade?
Since I took this initiative as a father of aid for trade in 2005, when I became DG of WTO, European Development Fund, USAID, MCC, the Japanese development system, including India, China, Brazil, they have refocused on aid for trade, and that's great. I mean, the amount of international development assistance going to aid for trade has moved from roughly $30 billion 8 years ago to 60 now. Now, that's not the whole story. We all know that you need the private sector, you need private business to engage into that. But I think the priorities are pretty clear. It's logistics, infrastructures, and removing the thickness of borders, especially in places like Africa, who unfortunately inherited from history an incredible number of countries on a relatively small continent if you compare it to Asia, for instance. Now, the number of landlocked countries in Africa is a big drag on African development because they have to pay for the transit going to the West Coast or the East Coast. If I'm a London drinking water consumer, a third of the price I pay is going to what's happening between the port of Mombasa and my place near Kigali. So that's the real issue, and that's, I think, the priority for the moment. And I think and I believe it will take place, we'll see, if there is a big multilateral agreement on trade facilitation, which I hope there will be, then, for instance, the European Development Fund should, in the future, reprioritize in supporting African, Caribbean, some Latin American countries addressing this problem of frontier bottlenecks.
And I guess a lot of this, though, is linked to the reason Doha didn't get agreed upon, which is things like agricultural subsidies, because if in the end European Development Fund and others support local agriculture in places like Africa, it does become globally competitive potentially, right?
That's correct. Although the shift that took place in 2008 on international food prices was from downwards depression of international prices during 30 years to an upwards trend of international food prices for the next 30 years. I mean, in these conditions, agricultural subsidies that were linked to low prices have waned. So other things than agriculture, I'm not saying agricultural subsidies are not important, they remain an issue, not least because if prices were to get depressed again, they would probably shoot up again. But things like trade facilitation, i.e. technology for improving border crossing, are probably a priority, which is why this has become top of the negotiation in the WTO.
Well, would it be fair to say then, to kind of summarize your point, that it would be great to have a multilateral agreement, a Doha round agreement, but even if we don't get that now, there's much we can do to facilitate trade?
That's absolutely correct. I'm sure the tough knots in the Doha round will need to be addressed sometime in the future, but as of today, shrinking the cost of crossing borders, which is roughly 10% of the value of trade, is twice as much as the average tariff you have to pay. So it has become a priority. I'm not saying that tariffs do not matter anymore,
Right.
but administration of borders matters twice as much as tariffs. And then we've got to be pragmatic, realistic. Let's start with what matters most.
Well, that's a great message, and we'll read the book to learn more. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Very good.